Good evening, night creatures. Tonight we move on from the primordial gods to the Titans. Let us first discuss the Devourer of Time, Cronus. Prologue. The god who ate his children. There is a story that every culture tells in some form. The story of the father who fears the son. It appears in the royal courts of history, where kings have executed or exiled their heirs out of suspicion that the succession was coming too soon. It appears in the psychology of every family, where an aging parent watches a child surpass them and feels something more complicated than pride. It appears in the structure of institutions, where the founder clings to control long after the founding moment has passed, unable to release what they built into hands that might shape it differently. The Greek tradition told this story with a vividness that exceeded almost every other culture's version. The father, who, having learned that his child would overthrow him, swallowed each child whole as it was born. Not killed them, not exposed them on a mountainside to die of nature's indifference, which was the more common mythological solution to the unwanted child. Swallowed them, kept them inside his own body, in the dark, unborn in the only sense that mattered, prevented from ever entering the world they were entitled to enter. This is Cronus. He is, in the popular shorthand that has survived into the modern world, simply the monster, the titan who ate his own children, the figure of devouring time, through the later confusion with Cronus, the personification of time itself, a confusion the Romans encouraged when they identified him with Saturn, the cautionary tale about what fear does to a father. This shorthand is not wrong. It is true that he swallowed his children. It is true that the fear which drove him to do this was a real and devastating fear, and that the swallowing was a real and devastating crime. The mythology does not soften this. Cronus is not redeemed in the way that some difficult figures in mythology are eventually redeemed. He remains, through most of the tradition, the figure of the devouring fear. But the shorthand is incomplete, and the incompleteness matters. Before he was the father who swallowed his children, he was the youngest of the Titans, the one who was not afraid to act when his older siblings hesitated, the one who took the sickle his mother gave him and ended the tyranny of his own father. Before he became what he became, he was the one who freed the world from the confinement that had been imposed on the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handed. He was, in the earliest moment of his mythology, the liberator. He ruled, in the tradition that the Romans developed most fully, over an age of gold, a time before the harsh labor and the moral compromise of the subsequent ages, a time when the earth gave freely and men lived without war or want. This was not the tradition that emphasized his crimes. This was the tradition that remembered something else about him, that under his reign, before the fear took hold, there had been something worth remembering as paradise. He was overthrown by his own son, exactly as he had feared, in exactly the way that the pattern required, the pattern he had himself enacted against his own father. He was confined, in most versions, in Tartarus alongside the other defeated Titans. In other versions, including the one that became most influential in the Roman world, he was not confined, but exiled, and ruled in his exile over the Blessed Isles, or became the king of a golden age in a different time, in a place beyond the ordinary world, where his reign continued in a form that had shed its violence. He is the most paradoxical of all the major figures in Greek mythology, the liberator who became the oppressor, the youngest son who became the feared father, the one who ended a tyranny by enacting the same fear that had produced it, the king of a golden age who is remembered in the same breath as a monster. This is his story, told in full, with the crime given its full weight and the complexity given its full weight as well, because flattening him into the simple monster of the popular shorthand does an injustice to what the mythology actually preserved. An account of how fear becomes cruelty, how the liberator can become what he liberated the world from, and how a single act, devastating and real, does not erase what came before it, or what, in certain tellings, came after. The Youngest Titan. Part 1. Born of Sky and Earth. Chapter 1. The 12. He was the youngest of the 12 Titans, the children of Cronus and Gaia, the divine generation that emerged from the union of the sky and the earth in the primordial age, before the gods had organized themselves into the structures that would govern the cosmos. The 12 were paired in the way that the mythology preferred its divine genealogies to be paired. 6 sons and 6 daughters, each one a fundamental principle of the world, given divine form. Oceanus and Tethys, the world-encircling river and the goddess of fresh water, the source of all the rivers and springs. Hyperion and Thea, the Titan of the heavenly light and the goddess who would bear the sun and moon and dawn. Coeus and Phoebe, lesser known but no less fundamental, associated with intellect and prophecy. Creus, associated with the constellations and the heavens' order. Iapetus, who would father Atlas and Prometheus and Epimetheus, the line that would matter most to the story of humanity. Themis, divine law and order, the personification of natural justice. Mnemosyne, memory, the mother of the muses, and Rhea, who would become his wife and partner in everything that followed, and Cronus, the youngest, the last-born of the 12, which in many mythological traditions marked a figure for a particular kind of significance, the youngest who would prove unexpectedly capable, the last child who carried within them the resolution that the older siblings, settled into their established positions, did not need to develop. He was born into a world that was already suffering. This needs to be understood before anything else about his early character. He did not begin his story in peace. He began it in the awareness of an ongoing injustice, an injustice that had been happening since before his birth, and that continued throughout his childhood and into his adulthood. His father, Uranus, the sky itself, the vast covering presence that surrounded the earth on every side, was afraid of his children. Not all his children equally, but afraid enough of the pattern they represented, afraid enough of what they might become, that he had taken an extreme measure. He pushed each child back into Gaia's body as it was born, refusing to let them emerge fully into the world, confining them in the darkness of the earth, from which they had only partially emerged. Cronus grew up, to the extent that divine beings of his nature grew up in any sense analogous to mortal development, with the knowledge of this confinement. His older siblings, the ones who had managed to be born into the world, before the confinement became absolute, still carried the awareness of what their younger potential siblings, the Cyclopes, the 100-handed, were enduring in the depths of their mother's body. This was his inheritance, not power freely given, but injustice witnessed from the beginning. Chapter 2. The Confined Ones. The mythology was specific about who Uranos had confined and why, and the specificity matters for understanding the moral world that Cronus was raised in. The Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, whose names meant thunder, lightning, and bright, were beings of extraordinary craft. They were not monsters in the sense the later tradition would sometimes flatten them into. They were divine smiths, the beings who would eventually forge the instruments of the gods' greatest power. Their single eye was not a deformity in the mythological imagination, but a mark of their particular nature. Focused, intense, capable of a kind of seeing that the more conventional two-eyed gods did not possess. The 100-handed, Cottus, Briareos, and Gyges, were beings of a different and even more extreme kind. Each had 50 heads and 100 hands. They were strength itself, given divine form at a scale that exceeded ordinary divine power. They were not craftsmen like their Cyclopean brothers. They were force, raw and comprehensive, the physical power of the cosmos concentrated into 3 beings. Uranos looked at these particular children and felt something beyond the general fear of succession that the prophecy had given him. He felt the specific fear of being exceeded, the recognition that the Cyclopes' craft exceeded what he could create, that the 100-handed strength exceeded what he could wield. And rather than welcome this excellence as a contribution to the world he governed, he refused to let it exist. He pushed them back into Gaia's depths, kept them in the dark, denied them the chance to be what they were capable of being. This was cruelty of a specific kind, distinguishable from the more general fear of the succession. It was the cruelty of refusing excellence in others because the excellence challenged one's own sense of supremacy. It was small in a way that the cosmic scale of the figures involved did not diminish. The smallness of the insecure parent who cannot bear to be exceeded by the child. Gaia bore this confinement in her own body, in pain that the mythology described vividly. The earth in a kind of perpetual labor, holding children who could not be born, carrying within her depths a wrong that grew heavier the longer it continued. Cronus, growing among the Titans who had been allowed to emerge, understood from the earliest moment of his consciousness that this injustice was ongoing. He understood that his own birth and the births of his older siblings represented a partial victory. They had emerged before the confinement became total, but that the victory was incomplete as long as the Cyclopes and the 100-handed remained in the dark. This understanding shaped him in ways that the mythology does not always make explicit, but that the events of his early story imply clearly. He was raised with a sense of injustice that needed correcting. And this sense, more than any abstract ambition for power, was what moved him toward the action that would define his early reputation. Chapter 3. The Sickle of Adamant. Gaia made the decision to act, and she made the instrument of the action herself, from her own substance. A great sickle, described in some traditions as made of adamant, a substance harder than any ordinary stone or metal, hard enough to do what needed to be done to a being as vast and fundamental as the sky itself. She brought this sickle to her children, not to all of them publicly and simultaneously, in the way a council might be convened, but in the manner the mythology suggests. She went to them, told them what she had endured, and what her unborn children continued to endure, and asked for their help in ending it. The mythology preserves a striking detail here. The older Titans, when asked, were afraid. Hyperion, vast and bright as he was, Oceanus, who encircled the entire world, Iapetus, whose own descendants would shape the fate of humanity. Each of them, when confronted with the question of whether to act against their own father, against the sky itself, against the totality that covered everything, hesitated. The fear of challenging Uranus, of confronting the primordial authority that had governed the cosmos since before any of them could remember a different arrangement, was too great. Only Cronus said yes. This is the moment that defines his early character, and it deserves to be understood in its full weight before the later corruption is allowed to overshadow it. When the older, more established, more powerful Titans hesitated out of fear, the youngest among them did not hesitate. He took the sickle his mother offered. He agreed to do what needed to be done. Why was he the one who could act when his older siblings could not? The mythology does not explain this directly, but the pattern itself suggests an answer that recurs across many traditions and many stories. The youngest child, not yet settled into an established position within the existing order, often has less invested in that order's continuation. The older Titans had grown into their domains, had settled into a way of being within the cosmos as it currently existed under Uranos' authority. Cronus, as the last-born, had grown up entirely within the awareness of injustice, without ever experiencing a settled position that the change might threaten. He had less to lose in the calculation that fear performs, even when it does not announce itself as calculation. And he had, perhaps, simply more courage, or less fear, which the mythology does not always distinguish from courage, though the two are not identical. He took the sickle. He agreed to the plan his mother proposed. And in doing so, he became, for this single crucial moment in the deep mythological past, the one figure among all the Titans willing to risk everything to end a wrong that had been allowed to continue for too long. Chapter 4. The Castration. Gaia arranged the circumstances. Uranos, in the pattern of his relationship with the earth, would come to her in the night, in the intimate covering that was the sky's relationship with the ground beneath it. The descent of darkness, the closeness of the heavens, pressed near to the earth in the hours before dawn. Cronus hid, waiting, in the place his mother had prepared, with the adamant sickle in his hand. When Uranos came, in the most vulnerable moment of his intimacy with Gaia, Cronus acted. He swung the sickle and castrated his father, severing the organ of his generative power, the very capacity that had produced Cronus himself and all his siblings, and that, in Uranos' fear, had been turned toward the confinement and oppression of the youngest of those productions. The mythology describes what happened to what was severed with a vividness that has remained one of the most famous images in all of Greek myth. Cronus threw it into the sea. From the blood that fell upon the earth came the Erinyes, the Furies, the spirits of vengeance, who would pursue those who violated the deepest bonds of family and oath, born appropriately enough from this most fundamental violation of the bond between father and son. From the same blood came the giants and the Miliae, the ash-tree nymphs. And from the sea foam that gathered around what had been thrown into the waters came Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, born from the violence done to the primordial generative power, rising from the foam in a birth that combined, in a single image, the most extreme violence the mythology had yet depicted, and the emergence of the most beautiful and beloved of the goddesses. This image deserves to be held in its full complexity, rather than simplified into either pure horror or pure triumph. It was an act of violence, a son mutilating his father, ending Uranos's capacity for further generation, a literal and devastating wound inflicted in the most intimate possible circumstance. The mythology does not romanticize this. Castration is castration. The violence is real and is depicted as real. And it was also, simultaneously, an act of liberation. Uranos's tyranny over Gaia and his children ended. The confinement of the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handed could now, in principle, be addressed, though the mythology's actual unfolding of events shows this liberation to be far more limited and complicated than the act itself might suggest. And from the violence came Aphrodite, came love itself, in one of the mythological tradition's most resonant claims about the relationship between destruction and creation, between the ending of one form of power and the emergence of an entirely new force in the world. Uranos, defeated and wounded, withdrew from his former intimacy with Gaia. The sky and the earth, which had been pressed close together in the primordial age, separated. The sky rising to the height it has occupied ever since. The space between heaven and earth, opening to allow for the world that would develop within that space. This separation was Cronus's first great achievement. He created the space in which the subsequent world could exist. By ending Uranos's oppressive closeness to Gaia, he made room, literally, cosmologically, for everything that followed. Chapter 5. The Prophecy and the Curse. As Uranos withdrew in his defeat, the mythology preserves an important detail. He named his Titan children with a word that carried both description and curse. He called them Titanes, a name the tradition connected to the verb meaning to strain or to overreach, suggesting that in striking at their father, they had strained beyond the proper boundary, reached for something that exceeded their rightful place. And he prophesied, or cursed, the line between prophecy and curse, blurring in the way it often does in mythological pronouncements, made in moments of defeat and pain, that they would be punished for what they had done, that the pattern they had enacted against him would, in time, be enacted against them. This curse prophecy is crucial to understanding everything that follows in Cronus's story. He did not act in ignorance of the possibility that the same fate might eventually befall him. The defeated Uranos, in the very moment of his defeat, told his children, told Cronus specifically, as the one who had wielded the sickle, that this pattern would not end with this single act. It would continue. The sons would face their own sons. Cronus heard this. The mythology does not record his immediate reaction to the curse, but everything in his subsequent behavior suggests that he heard it, understood it, and carried it forward as a genuine fear, rather than dismissing it as the powerless rage of a defeated enemy. This is important because it complicates the simple narrative that some versions of the mythology present, in which Cronus's later fear of his own children appears almost arbitrary, a vice that descended on him without clear cause, as though tyranny were simply his nature, waiting to emerge once he held power. The fuller account suggests something more tragic. He was told, by the father he had just overthrown, in the very moment of that overthrow, that he would face the same fate. He carried this knowledge forward into his reign, and it shaped everything that followed. The pattern was established at the very founding moment of the divine succession. Violence answered with the prophecy of future violence. Fear answered with the curse of future fear. Cronus did not invent this pattern. He inherited it in the most direct way possible, from the very father he had defeated. What he did with this inheritance, how he carried it forward, what it made him become, is the central tragedy of his story. Part 2. The Reign Begins. Chapter 6. The New Order. With Uranos defeated and withdrawn, the Titans took up the governance of the cosmos. This was not, in the earliest accounts, an immediate transfer of supreme power to Cronus alone. The Titans as a generation governed their respective domains, much as the Olympians would later govern theirs. Oceanus continued to encircle the world with his waters. Hyperion continued to be associated with the heavenly light, fathering through Theia the sun, moon, and dawn. The various Titans took up the functions that their natures suited them for. But Cronus, as the one who had acted when the others hesitated, as the one who had wielded the sickle and ended Uranos's tyranny, emerged as the leader among them, the king of the Titans, the one who held the position of supreme authority that Uranos had held before him. This ascension was not purely the result of the act of castration itself, though that act established his courage and his willingness to do what needed to be done. It also reflected something about the structure of divine succession that the mythology took as a given. Power passed to the one capable of seizing and holding it, and Cronus had demonstrated both capacities in the most dramatic possible fashion. He married Rhea, his sister, in the pattern of divine unions among the primordial generation that did not carry the social prohibitions the mortal world would later develop. The unions of the Titans being understood as the appropriate combination of complementary cosmic principles rather than as transgressions against family structure. Rhea, whose own domain was associated with fertility, with the comfortable and generative aspects of motherhood and the earth's abundance, became his queen. Together, in the earliest period of his reign, before the fear took hold and transformed everything, they presided over what later tradition, particularly the Roman tradition that identified Cronus with Saturn, would remember as a golden age. Chapter 7. The Age of Gold. The poet Hesiod, writing not in the Theogony, but in his other great work, Works and Days, described the successive ages of humanity, and the first of these, the Golden Age, he placed explicitly under the reign of Cronus. In this age, Hesiod wrote, men lived like gods, free from toil and grief. The earth gave its bounty freely, without the need for the harsh labor that would characterize the subsequent ages. There was no old age in any painful sense. People lived long, gentle lives and passed into death as if falling asleep, without the terror or suffering that mortality would later carry. There was no war, no violence between men, no need for the elaborate structures of law and punishment that later ages would require to manage human conflict. This was the world under Cronus's early reign, or at least, this was what the tradition remembered of it, in the selective and idealizing way that traditions often remember golden pasts. Whether this idealized memory corresponds to anything that actually happened in the mythological sequence of events, or whether it represents a later cultural nostalgia projected backward onto the figure of the original king, the tradition itself preserved this memory as genuinely Cronus's. He was, for some span of his reign, the king of paradise. The Roman tradition developed this aspect of his mythology most fully, identifying him with their god Saturn and establishing the festival of Saturnalia in his honor, a winter festival during which the ordinary social hierarchies were suspended. Masters served their slaves, gambling was permitted, gifts were exchanged, and a spirit of equality and abundance prevailed that was explicitly understood as a temporary return to the conditions of Saturn's golden reign. This is a crucial counterweight to the simple monster narrative that the swallowing of his children has come to dominate. Whatever Cronus became, there was a period, remembered across centuries, celebrated in actual religious practice, invoked whenever people wanted to imagine a better and more equal world, in which his reign represented the best the world had ever known. The question this raises, and that the rest of his story must grapple with, is how the king of the Golden Age became the devourer of his own children. What happened between the paradise of the early reign and the horror of the later years? Chapter 8. The First Signs of Fear. The mythology does not give a precise narrative of the transition from Golden King to fearful tyrant. The accounts move somewhat abruptly from the establishment of his reign to the revelation that he had begun, upon Rhea's first pregnancies, to swallow each child as it was born. But certain elements of the broader mythological context suggest how this transition might have occurred, and they deserve to be examined with the same care given to his earlier heroism. He had heard the curse prophecy from his own father in the moment of Uranos's defeat. This knowledge did not disappear, simply because his early reign was peaceful and abundant. It would have remained present, a knowledge held alongside the day-to-day governance, a shadow at the edge of an otherwise golden experience. The awareness that the pattern he had enacted was a pattern that, by its very logic, applied to him as much as it had applied to his father. The Titanomachy had not yet occurred. The great war that would eventually see Cronus and his fellow Titans overthrown by Zeus had not happened yet in the sequence of events, but its later occurrence confirms that the curse Uranos pronounced was not idle. Something in the structure of the cosmos, in the pattern of divine succession that the mythology depicts as nearly inevitable, made the curse accurate. And whether Cronus could sense this inevitability, or whether his fear created a self-fulfilling response to a curse that might otherwise have remained merely a curse, the mythology leaves genuinely ambiguous. What is clear is this: When Rhea became pregnant with their first child, something shifted in Cronus. The man, the Titan, who had been brave enough to act against the greatest power in the cosmos, brave enough to risk everything to end his father's tyranny, became, in the face of his own potential fatherhood, afraid in a way he had not been afraid before. This is one of the most psychologically resonant elements of the entire myth, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. Courage against an external threat, and courage in the face of one's own eventual obsolescence, are not the same kind of courage. Cronus had been willing to risk death to end an injustice being done to others. He was not willing to risk his own position to allow the natural succession of generations to occur. The same being could hold both of these capacities, extraordinary bravery in one direction, devastating cowardice in another, without contradiction, because they were responses to fundamentally different kinds of threat. Chapter 9. The First Swallowing. When Hestia was born, the firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, who would become the goddess of the hearth, of home, of the sacred fire that anchored every household, Cronus did not push the child back into the earth as his own father had done to him and his siblings. He had a different method, suited to his own particular fear, and his own particular relationship to the curse he carried. He swallowed her. The mythology presents this with stark simplicity. The child was born, and Cronus took her and swallowed her whole, keeping her alive within his own body, rather than allowing her to exist in the world where she might, eventually, fulfill the prophecy and overthrow him. This was, in its mechanics, both more merciful and more horrifying than Uranus's confinement of the Cyclopes and the 100-handed. More merciful in the sense that the children, swallowed rather than confined in dark depths, continued to exist within their father's own body. A strange and terrible intimacy, the parent containing the child, rather than simply imprisoning it elsewhere. More horrifying in the sense that this containment was total and personal, in a way that confinement in the earth, however cruel, was not. Cronus made his own body the prison, made his own continued existence the mechanism of the children's confinement, ensured that as long as he lived and digested nothing, his children would remain trapped within him in a state that was neither death nor true life. This is what happened to Hestia, and then to Demeter, who would become the goddess of grain and the harvest, of the earth's fertility translated into agricultural abundance, and then to Hera, who would become the goddess of marriage and the most powerful of the female Olympians, and then to Hades, who would become the lord of the dead, the king of the underworld, and then to Poseidon, who would become the god of the sea, second only to Zeus among the male Olympians in raw power. 5 children, 5 swallowings, 5 times that Rhea gave birth to a child she had carried and labored to bring into the world, only to watch her husband take that child and consume it, removing it from the world of the living and visible into the strange suspended existence within his own body. The mythology does not dwell extensively on Rhea's experience of this repeated horror, but it is impossible not to imagine it. The anticipation of each pregnancy, shadowed by the certainty of what would follow. The labor undertaken with the foreknowledge that its product would be immediately taken from her. The repeated grief of watching her children disappear into her husband's body again and again, 5 times, with no end in sight and no recourse available to her. Chapter 10. What the swallowing meant. It is worth pausing to consider what this act actually represented beyond its surface horror, because the mythology's choice of this particular method, swallowing rather than killing, rather than exposing, rather than any of the other methods available to a mythological tyrant seeking to eliminate a threat, carries specific meaning. Cronus did not want his children dead. This distinction matters enormously. He could have killed them outright. Divine beings could be killed, or at least permanently destroyed in various mythological traditions, and even where true death was complicated for immortal beings, exposure or destruction by other means was available to him. He chose instead to keep them alive, contained, suspended, but alive, within himself. This suggests that his motivation was not the elimination of his children as such, but the prevention of their independent existence in the world, where they might grow, might gather allies, might eventually challenge him. He was not trying to destroy what he had created. He was trying to prevent it from developing beyond his control. This is, in a sense, an even more troubling form of the fear than simple destruction would represent. The parent who kills the child out of fear of being overthrown is enacting a horrifying, but at least straightforward violence. The parent who keeps the child contained, suspended, prevented from growing or developing or ever becoming independent, while still, in some sense, keeping them, is enacting something closer to a perverse form of possessiveness, a refusal to let the child exist as anything other than an extension of the parent's own controlled body. Cronus's children within him were not growing. They were not developing into the gods they would eventually become. They were held in stasis, present but not present, alive but not living, existing but not existing in any way that mattered to the world outside his body. This was the specific horror of his solution, not death, but a kind of suspended non-life that prevented the children from ever becoming who they were meant to become. The later imagery of Cronus as Father Time, the Devourer associated with the passage of time itself, through the conflation with Kronos that the tradition increasingly indulged in, particularly in the Renaissance and after, draws additional resonance from this aspect of the myth. Time, too, can be experienced as something that consumes the potential of what it contains, that holds moments suspended only to ultimately disgorge them, transformed, or to never release them at all. Cronus swallowing his children became, in the cultural imagination that developed long after the original myth, a powerful image for how time consumes possibility, how potential can be held in stasis, how growth can be prevented by the very forces meant to nurture it. The Stone and the Salvation. Part 3. Rhea's Resistance. Chapter 11. A Mother's Calculation. By the time Rhea was pregnant with her 6th child, she had endured 5 repetitions of the same devastating cycle: pregnancy, labor, birth, and then the swallowing. 5 times she had brought a child into the world, only to watch it disappear into her husband's body. 5 times she had grieved a loss that was not death, but was not far from it. A loss without the finality of death, which might have allowed some form of closure, but with all of death's removal of the child from her presence and her care. The mythology does not record extensive interior reflection from Rhea during this period. The ancient sources tend toward action and event rather than psychological interiority in the modern sense. But the actions she eventually took reveal a mind that had been working throughout those 5 losses on the problem of how to break the pattern. She went to her own mother, to Gaia, the earth itself, the primordial grandmother who had once given Cronus the sickle that ended Uranus's tyranny, and who now, watching her own grandchildren consumed by the sun she had once helped to power, found herself confronting the consequences of the pattern she had helped establish. This is one of the most poignant elements of the broader mythological structure. Gaia, who had ended one tyranny by empowering Cronus against his father, now found herself complicit, in a sense, in a new tyranny that her intervention had helped create. The pattern she had set in motion, son overthrows father through violence, ends one form of oppression, had not ended with that single act. It had become a self-perpetuating cycle, and now her own grandchildren were paying the price. She did not hesitate to act again. If anything, the mythology suggests a kind of grim determination in Gaia's response to this second crisis. Having helped end one cycle of confinement, she would help end this one as well, even though it meant working against the very son she had previously empowered. Chapter 12. The Plan with the Stone. Gaia and Rhea developed a plan together, one that drew on the specific vulnerability in Cronus's method of containing his children. He swallowed them, which meant he needed to be deceived about what precisely he was swallowing. When Rhea's labor came for her 6th child, the one who would become Zeus, she gave birth in secret, away from Cronus's immediate awareness, and arranged for the infant to be spirited away to a hidden location. Different traditions place this hiding in different locations, most prominently in a cave on Crete, on Mount Ida or Mount Dicte, where the infant could be raised away from his father's knowledge and his father's threat. In place of the actual infant, Rhea presented Cronus with a stone, wrapped in swaddling clothes, disguised to resemble a newborn child in size and shape, prepared with enough care and presented with enough confidence that Cronus, expecting nothing other than what had happened 5 times before, swallowed it without examination. This moment is, in its way, one of the most remarkable in the entire mythological tradition. The great Titan, the one who had ended his own father's tyranny through decisive and violent action, the king of the Golden Age, the figure powerful enough to be feared by his own children before they were even born, was deceived by a stone wrapped in cloth, presented to him by his own wife, without ever realizing what he had actually consumed. The mythology preserves a specific irony in this. Cronus, so consumed by fear of his children's potential power, that he had reduced himself to consuming them whole, one after another, was ultimately defeated not by power, but by deception, not by force, but by his wife's careful management of his expectations. The pattern of fear that had made him a tyrant also made him, in this specific instance, vulnerable, predictable enough in his expected behavior that Rhea could exploit that predictability to save her 6th child. This stone, in some traditions, was later placed at Delphi, becoming the omphalos, the navel of the world, a sacred stone that marked the center of the cosmos in Greek religious geography. The object that had once been swallowed in place of the infant Zeus became, in this later tradition, one of the most sacred objects in the Greek world, a literal and symbolic center point that connected the deepest mythological past to ongoing religious practice in historical Greece. Chapter 13. The Hidden Child. Zeus grew up away from his father's knowledge in the cave on Crete, or in the various other locations that different traditions preferred, nursed and protected by figures who varied across different versions of the myth. Sometimes the goat nymph Amalthea, whose horn would become the cornucopia, the horn of plenty in later tradition. Sometimes nymphs more generally, sometimes in some accounts by Gaia herself, the grandmother who had set this entire rescue in motion. The Curetes, armed dancers, young divine or semi-divine beings, are sometimes credited with protecting the infant by clashing their weapons and shields together whenever he cried, drowning out the sound that might otherwise have alerted Cronus to the deception. This detail, whatever its precise origin, captures something important about the precariousness of Zeus's early existence, even as an infant successfully hidden from his father. The threat of discovery remained constant, requiring active and ongoing protection rather than simple concealment alone. He grew, as divine beings in these myths often grow, more rapidly than mortal children. Not instantaneously, not in the way some later, more compressed mythological accounts might suggest, but swiftly enough that within what the mythology treats as a relatively contained span of time, he had developed from the hidden infant into a young god of considerable power and consciousness, fully aware of his own identity, his father's crime, and the fate of his 5 siblings, still trapped within Cronus's body. This period of hidden growth, Zeus developing in secret, away from the father who would have destroyed or contained him had he known of the deception, established a pattern that would recur with variations throughout subsequent mythology. The hero or god who must develop their full power away from the threat that would otherwise prevent that development, who reaches maturity in concealment before emerging to confront what they were hidden from. What Zeus knew throughout this period of growth, the mythology suggests clearly. He knew about his father's crime. He knew that 5 siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, remained trapped within Cronus, suspended in whatever strange existence the swallowing had imposed on them. He grew up not merely to claim power for himself, but with a specific liberating purpose already established before he ever confronted his father directly. He intended, from the moment he understood the situation, to free his siblings. Chapter 14. Metis and the Potion. When Zeus reached the maturity that the mythology treats as readiness for confrontation, he did not approach his father directly with violence as his first strategy. Instead, with the guidance of Metis, a titaness associated with wisdom and cunning counsel, who would later become significant in her own right as the mother of Athena and as a figure whom Zeus himself would eventually need to be wary of, in an echo of the very pattern this story concerns. He devised a more subtle approach. Metis prepared a potion, an emetic substance designed to induce vomiting, and arranged for this to be administered to Cronus, in some versions disguised as a drink offered to him, in some versions through more elaborate deception, involving Zeus presenting himself initially not as the threatening son, but as a cup-bearer or servant whose true identity Cronus did not recognize. The effectiveness of this potion, when consumed, produced one of the most visually arresting moments in the entire mythological sequence. Cronus, affected by what he had unknowingly ingested, vomited up everything he had swallowed. Beginning in the reverse order of consumption, with the stone that had stood in for Zeus himself, and then, in succession, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and finally Hestia, the firstborn, who had been within him longest of all. The 5 siblings emerged, fully grown despite their long suspension, within their father's body. The mythology treating their internal existence not as a period of arrested development that left them as infants, but as a strange preservation that maintained them in a state from which they emerged as adult or near-adult divine beings, ready to take their place alongside Zeus in the conflict that would follow. This moment of disgorgement is, in its way, a kind of birth in reverse. Not the emergence of new life from the womb, but the release of previously living beings from a different kind of containment, an unswallowing that reversed the original crime and restored to the world what had been wrongfully taken from it. The stone, vomited up alongside the actual children, was later set up, as noted at Delphi in some traditions, as a memorial to this entire sequence of events. The deception that had saved Zeus, the eventual reversal that freed his siblings, the physical object that connected the deepest mythological past to the sacred geography of historical Greek religious practice. Part 4. The Gathering Storm. Chapter 15. The 5 Restored. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon emerged from their father's body into a world that none of them, except perhaps in some attenuated form of awareness during their suspension, had ever truly experienced as conscious, independent beings. They emerged as adults, with the divine power and awareness appropriate to their adult forms, but without the lived experience of growing into that awareness gradually, the way Zeus had grown in his hidden cave. The mythology does not dwell extensively on what this experience was like for them, what it meant to suddenly exist, fully formed, after an unknown span of suspended containment within the very being who had imprisoned them. But the implications are significant for understanding the alliance that formed in the aftermath. These were beings who had been directly and personally wronged by Cronus in the most intimate possible way, swallowed by their own father, denied the chance to develop and grow, as Zeus had been allowed to develop and grow in his concealment. Their anger toward Cronus, when the mythology depicts the subsequent war, carries this weight. This was not merely a political conflict about who should hold supreme power in the cosmos. It was, for the 5 who had been swallowed, a deeply personal reckoning with the father who had imprisoned them within his own body for the crime of having been born to him. They allied immediately and completely with Zeus, the brother who had orchestrated their liberation. This alliance, the 6 children of Cronus and Rhea, united against their father, would become the founding core of what the mythology calls the Olympians, the divine generation that would eventually govern the cosmos in the arrangement that persisted through the rest of Greek mythology and religious practice. But the 5 siblings and Zeus alone, however powerful, were not yet sufficient to overthrow Cronus and the Titans who supported him. What followed was not an immediate confrontation, but a gathering of forces, a preparation for what would become one of the most cataclysmic conflicts in the entire mythological tradition, the Titanomachy. Chapter 16. The Sides Forming. The conflict that was building did not divide neatly along generational lines, though the popular shorthand often presents it as simply Titans versus Olympians, in a way that obscures the more complicated allegiances actually present in the mythological sources. Some Titans sided with Zeus against Cronus, most notably Themis, the Titaness of divine law and order, and her son Prometheus. In some accounts, though Prometheus's parentage and allegiances vary across sources, supported the younger generation, perhaps recognizing something in Cronus's rule, particularly its later tyrannical aspect, that violated the very principles of order and justice that Themis represented. Oceanus, the world-encircling Titan, notably remained neutral or withdrew from direct participation in the conflict, a choice that the mythology treats as significant, though not always elaborated upon, perhaps reflecting a recognition that the conflict, however it resolved, would not fundamentally alter the river's eternal encircling of the world, or perhaps reflecting a more general wisdom about the cost of involvement in conflicts between the more directly power-hungry members of the divine family. But the bulk of the Titans, and certainly Cronus himself as their leader, prepared for war against Zeus and his siblings. The cosmos itself was preparing to be torn apart by a conflict between the generation that had governed since the defeat of Uranos and the new generation seeking to claim power for itself. This is the moment in the mythological sequence where Cronus's earlier identity, the brave youngest son who had ended his father's tyranny, and his later identity, the fearful tyrant who had swallowed his own children, collapse into a single figure facing the consequences of both. He was, simultaneously, the original liberator whose courage had once been necessary and admirable, and the very tyrant that a new liberator now needed to overthrow. He had become, through the working of the pattern that his own father had cursed him with, exactly what he had once risen up against. The mythology does not suggest that Cronus himself necessarily recognized this irony with any clarity, though the parallel is unmistakable to anyone considering the full arc of his story. A son acting against a tyrannical father who feared his children, ending that tyranny through violence, and now a new son acting against him, a tyrannical father who had feared his own children to the point of swallowing them, preparing to end this tyranny through violence as well. The pattern Uranos had cursed his children with at the founding moment of divine succession was playing out exactly as prophesied, with Cronus now occupying the position his own father had once occupied, facing his own son's rebellion with whatever combination of fear, denial, and determination that the mythology leaves largely to the imagination to supply. Chapter 17. The Titanomachy begins. The war that followed, The Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, is described in the mythological sources with a scale and violence that exceeds almost every other conflict in the Greek tradition. A conflict whose cosmic stakes and physical devastation set the template for understanding what war between divine forces of this magnitude could mean for the structure of reality itself. The Titans, under Cronus's leadership, held Mount Othrys as their stronghold. The Olympians, under Zeus's leadership, established themselves on Mount Olympus, the mountain that would give the new divine generation its enduring name and its enduring home. Between these two mountains, the war was fought for 10 years, a duration that the mythology treats not as a precise historical measurement, but as an indication of the war's grinding, seemingly endless quality. A conflict that resisted easy resolution, despite the cosmic power being wielded on both sides. Zeus and his siblings, despite their divine power, found themselves unable to achieve decisive victory against the Titans for the bulk of this decade-long conflict. The Titans, after all, represented an entire generation of cosmic forces, beings whose domains spanned the fundamental structures of reality, whose combined power was not easily overcome, even by 6 determined and capable Olympians. The turning point came, as it had at the founding moment of Cronus's own rise to power, through the intervention of Gaia, who once again provided crucial counsel and assistance to the side she judged to represent the more just cause. She advised Zeus to seek allies from among the beings still confined in the depths of the earth, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed, the very beings whose original confinement by Uranos had set this entire chain of events in motion generations before. This detail deserves particular attention. The original injustice that had motivated Cronus's own rebellion against his father, the confinement of these powerful beings, had apparently never been fully resolved, even after Cronus took power. Whether Cronus had simply never gotten round to freeing them, or had deliberately kept them confined for his own reasons, perhaps fearing their power just as his father had, the mythology does not fully clarify. But the implication is significant. Cronus, despite having acted to end one form of confinement at the founding of his reign, had allowed another form of confinement to persist throughout his rule, perhaps even perpetuating it for the same reasons of fear that had originally motivated his father. This represents one of the most damning details in the entire account of his reign, more damning in some ways than even the swallowing of his children, because it suggests that the liberator's early heroism had not, in fact, been fully realized, that he had stopped short of completing the liberation he had begun, perhaps out of the very fear that would later consume his relationship with his own offspring. Chapter 18. The Liberation of the Cyclopes and the 100-handed. Zeus, acting on Gaia's counsel, descended to free the Cyclopes and the 100-handed from their long confinement, beings who had now been imprisoned, in total, across the reigns of both Uranos and Cronus. An extraordinarily long span of suspended existence, even by the standards of immortal divine beings. The Cyclopes, freed and grateful, used their extraordinary craft to forge weapons for the Olympian cause. Most significantly, they created the thunderbolt for Zeus, the weapon that would become his signature instrument of power, the bolt of lightning that the mythology would forever after associate with his authority and his capacity for devastating, decisive action. They also crafted gifts for his siblings. Poseidon's trident, capable of shaking the earth and commanding the seas, and the helm of invisibility for Hades, allowing the future Lord of the Dead to move unseen. The 100-handed, freed and equally grateful, brought their overwhelming physical strength to bear directly in the conflict, throwing massive boulders with their 100 hands each, overwhelming the Titan forces with a barrage of devastating physical force that the Titans, however powerful individually, struggled to withstand. With these new allies and these new weapons, the balance of the war shifted decisively. Zeus, wielding his newly forged thunderbolt, became capable of strikes against the Titan forces that exceeded anything he had previously been able to bring to bear. The combined assault of the Olympians, the freed Cyclopes, and the freed 100-handed finally overwhelmed the Titan resistance. The mythology describes the final battles of this conflict in apocalyptic terms. The earth itself groaning under the violence, the sea boiling, the very foundations of the cosmos seeming to shake under the impact of this conflict between divine generations. Hesiod's account in particular emphasizes the scale of devastation, suggesting a conflict that nearly tore apart the structure of reality itself before finally resolving in the Olympians' favor. Cronus and the Titans who had fought alongside him were defeated. Chapter 19. The Confinement of the Titans. With the Titans defeated, Zeus and his Olympian allies faced the question of what to do with the vanquished. A question with particular resonance, given the entire pattern of confinement, fear, and succession that had brought them to this point. The decision, as the mythology records it, was confinement. Cronus and the Titans who had fought against the Olympians were bound and cast down into Tartarus, the deep abyss beneath the underworld, the most extreme depth of the cosmos, a place so far below the surface of the earth that the mythology measures the distance in terms that emphasize its almost unimaginable remoteness from the world of the living, and even from the ordinary realm of the dead. The 100-handed, who had fought so effectively in the war, were appointed as the guards of this confinement, a detail that carries its own ironic resonance, given that they themselves had so recently been the confined, now becoming the agents of confinement for those who had once held them prisoner. This is the moment at which the simple shorthand of Cronus defeated was confined in Tartarus becomes the dominant narrative in most subsequent tellings of his story. He disappears, in most versions, from the active mythological narrative at this point. No longer a figure who acts, but a figure who has been acted upon, contained in the depths. His reign ended, his crime seemingly answered by his own confinement at the hands of the children he had once tried to prevent from existing. The pattern that Uranus had cursed Cronus with at the founding moment of divine succession had now completed its cycle. The father who feared the son and acted with cruelty to prevent the son's rise had been overthrown by that very son, exactly as had happened to Uranus himself. The justice of this outcome, within the mythological logic, seems almost mathematically precise. Cruelty answered with overthrow, fear answered with confinement, the pattern completing itself with a kind of terrible symmetry. But this is not, in fact, the complete story of Cronus, and the tradition itself preserves alternative accounts that complicate this simple narrative of defeat and permanent confinement. Accounts that deserve serious attention precisely because they resist the easy resolution that tyrant gets what he deserves provides. Beyond the simple defeat. Part 5. The Alternative Traditions. Chapter 20. The Blessed Isles. Not all the mythological sources agree that Cronus's fate, after defeat, was permanent confinement in Tartarus. Hesiod himself, in Works and Days, the same work that established the memory of his Golden Age reign, preserves a different account of what became of him. In this telling, after the cycle of the ages of humanity has progressed through gold, silver, bronze, and into the age of heroes, Hesiod describes certain heroes who, rather than dying in the ordinary way or descending to the typical underworld, were instead granted a special fate. They were settled by Zeus at the ends of the earth, in the Isles of the Blessed, where the earth bears its fruit 3 times a year, and life continues in conditions reminiscent of the original Golden Age. And crucially, Hesiod writes that Cronus rules over these heroes in the Isles of the Blessed. This detail, easy to overlook amid the more dramatic narrative of the Titanomachy and the confinement in Tartarus, represents a significant complication to the simple story of permanent punishment. In this account, Cronus is not eternally confined in the darkest depths of the cosmos, suffering for his crimes alongside his fellow defeated Titans. He has instead been restored, in some sense, to a kingship, ruling not over the living, contentious world that the Olympians govern, but over a blessed realm reserved for the most honored heroes, a realm that explicitly echoes the conditions of his own original Golden Age. How are these two accounts, confinement in Tartarus and kingship in the Isles of the Blessed, to be reconciled? The ancient sources do not provide a clean resolution to this apparent contradiction, and modern scholarship has approached the question in various ways. As evidence of different regional or temporal traditions that were never fully harmonized, as evidence of evolving attitudes toward Cronus across the centuries during which these myths developed, or as evidence that the mythological tradition itself was comfortable holding contradictory accounts of the same figure's fate, without feeling compelled to resolve them into a single, authoritative narrative. But whatever the explanation for the contradiction, its presence in the tradition matters enormously for understanding how the ancient Greeks themselves understood Cronus. He was not, in the actual historical religious imagination, simply the monster who got what he deserved. He remained, in at least some significant strands of the tradition, a figure capable of restoration, of ruling again, even if that rule was now confined to a blessed realm, rather than the active governance of the cosmos. Chapter 21. Saturn and the Roman Reimagining. The Roman tradition's identification of Cronus with their own god Saturn developed this redemptive thread even further, and deserves separate consideration because it represents not merely a translation of Greek myth into Latin names, but a substantial reimagining of the figure's significance. Saturn, in the indigenous Roman tradition, before the systematic identification with Cronus took hold, was already associated with agriculture, with the harvest, with a mythical golden age of Italian prehistory, during which Saturn was said to have ruled over Latium, the region of Italy that would eventually contain Rome itself. In a time of peace, plenty, and equality, before the harsher conditions of subsequent history set in. When Roman writers and religious practice increasingly identified this indigenous figure with the Greek Cronus, the synthesis emphasized precisely the Golden Age aspects of Cronus's story that the Tartarus confinement narrative tends to overshadow. Saturn Cronus became, in Roman religious and literary imagination, primarily the god of a lost Golden Age, a figure of fundamentally benevolent and abundant rule, rather than primarily the figure of paternal violence and tyranny that the swallowing narrative emphasizes. The festival of Saturnalia, celebrated in December, became one of the most beloved and widely practiced festivals in the entire Roman calendar. A time of feasting, gift-giving, gambling normally forbidden, and a temporary suspension of the usual social hierarchies, during which masters and slaves might dine together, and the ordinary structures of Roman social order were playfully inverted in memory of the equality believed to have characterized Saturn's original golden reign. This is a remarkable transformation to consider. The figure who, in the starkest tellings of his Greek mythology, embodies paternal fear taken to its most horrifying extreme, swallowing his own children, became, in his Roman incarnation, the patron of one of antiquity's most joyful and widely beloved annual celebrations, a figure whose memory was invoked specifically to celebrate abundance, equality, and freedom from ordinary constraint. The early Christian tradition's eventual absorption of Saturnalia's customs into the developing celebration of Christmas, the timing, the gift-giving, the festive suspension of ordinary social roles, means that Cronus Saturn's influence, transformed and largely unrecognized, persists into the modern world's most widely celebrated winter festival, an extraordinary afterlife for a figure whose most famous mythological act remains the consumption of his own offspring. Chapter 22. The philosophical reimagining Cronus and time. A separate but related transformation of Cronus's mythological significance occurred through the persistent confusion, beginning in antiquity and intensifying through the Renaissance and beyond, between Cronus, the Titan, and Kronos, the personification of time itself, a related but distinct figure in Greek thought. This confusion, whatever its precise origins, proved enormously productive for the subsequent cultural imagination. Cronus, already associated with devouring his own children, became increasingly identified with the figure of Father Time. The bearded old man, often depicted with a scythe, itself an echo of the sickle with which Cronus had castrated Uranus, who represents the inexorable, consuming progress of time itself. This identification gave the myth of Cronus swallowing his children a new and powerful symbolic resonance that extended far beyond its original context. Time, too, consumes everything it produces. The moments that time brings into being, every event, every living thing, every achievement and creation, are, in a sense, swallowed by time, as it continues its inexorable progress, contained within the past that time has already consumed, no longer accessible to direct experience in the present. The Renaissance and Baroque artistic traditions developed this symbolic identification extensively. Paintings and sculptures depicting Saturn devouring his son, most famously Francisco Goya's deeply disturbing version, painted in the early 19th century, depicting a wild-eyed, monstrous Saturn in the act of consuming his child's body, drew on this conflated identity to create some of the most psychologically intense images in the Western artistic tradition. Images that resonate not merely as illustrations of an ancient myth, but as profound meditations on time's relationship to mortality, to the inevitable passing of all things, to the way that the present is constantly being consumed by the past, even as it gives birth to the future. This is, in an important sense, a separate mythology from the original Greek account of Cronus, a later cultural development that uses the figure for purposes quite distinct from the original story's concerns with divine succession and paternal fear. But its persistence and power testify to something genuinely resonant in the original myth. The image of a father consuming his children proved capable of bearing an enormous symbolic weight, capable of speaking to truths about time, mortality, and consumption that extend far beyond the specific mythological context in which the story originated. Part 6. The Psychology of Fear. Chapter 23. What Made Him Afraid? Having traced the full arc of his mythology, from courageous liberator to fearful tyrant to defeated king to, in some tellings, restored ruler of a blessed realm, it becomes possible to consider more carefully what the myth actually suggests about the nature of his fear, and what that fear might illuminate about fear more generally. Cronus's fear was not, on the evidence the mythology provides, a simple or irrational paranoia disconnected from any genuine threat. He had been told, explicitly, by his own defeated father, that the pattern he had just enacted would eventually be enacted against him. This was not an abstract anxiety, but a specific, articulated prophecy from a source, however biased by the bitterness of recent defeat, who had genuine reason to understand the pattern of divine succession, having just been its most recent victim. The fear, in other words, had a rational foundation. The question the myth raises is not whether Cronus's fear was justified. In the strictest sense, it was, since the succession did eventually occur exactly as predicted. But what he did with that justified fear, how he chose to respond to a threat that was, in fact, genuinely present in the structure of his cosmic situation. This distinction matters enormously for understanding the moral weight of his actions. A fear that turns out to be accurate is not thereby excused in its consequences. The accuracy of the fear and the morality of the response to that fear are separate questions. Cronus's fear that his children might eventually overthrow him was, as it turned out, entirely accurate. His response to that fear, swallowing each child as it was born, denying them any chance to exist independently in the world, prioritizing his own continued supremacy over the basic right of his offspring to exist and develop, was a moral catastrophe, regardless of the fear's accuracy. This is one of the most important ethical insights embedded in the myth, even if the ancient sources do not articulate it in precisely these terms. The validity of a fear does not justify any response to that fear. A father's fear that his child might someday surpass him even if that fear proves entirely correct, does not license the father in preventing that child's existence or development. The fear must be managed, contained, lived with, in a way that does not violate the fundamental claims of the threatening party to their own existence and development. Cronus failed this test completely. He let his accurate fear license a response of total domination and prevention, transforming himself from the courageous liberator who had once acted against exactly this kind of preventive cruelty into the very embodiment of that cruelty himself. Chapter 24. The Inheritance of Trauma. There is a psychological pattern well documented in human experience and clearly relevant to understanding Cronus's mythological arc, in which a person who has suffered harm, particularly harm inflicted by a parent or parental figure, goes on, despite their conscious intentions, to inflict similar harm on their own children or dependents. The cycle of abuse, as it is often called in clinical and popular psychological literature, describes precisely this pattern. Trauma inherited and then, often unconsciously, transmitted to the next generation. Cronus had grown up in the awareness of his father's cruelty, the confinement of the Cyclopes and the 100-handed, the general atmosphere of paternal fear and oppression that had characterized Uranus's reign before Cronus ended it. He had acted, at considerable personal risk, to end this cruelty. He had been, by the evidence of his early actions, someone who recognized injustice and was willing to risk himself to correct it. And yet, faced with his own potential fatherhood, faced with the curse prophecy that echoed the very pattern he had just disrupted, he repeated, in a different but recognizably related form, the cruelty he had once opposed. He did not confine his children in the earth as Uranus had done. He found his own method, swallowing rather than burying. But the underlying logic was identical. Prevent the children from existing independently, out of fear of what their independent existence might mean for the father's continued supremacy. This pattern, trauma transmitted across generations, the victim of cruelty becoming, in time, the perpetrator of a related cruelty, is one of the most psychologically resonant aspects of the entire myth, and it suggests a sophistication in the ancient mythological imagination that is easy to overlook when the story is reduced to its simplest monster who ate his children version. The myth seems to understand, intuitively if not in the language of modern psychology, that simply ending one generation's cruelty does not guarantee that the next generation will be free from repeating some version of that cruelty. The structures of fear, the patterns of response to threat, the specific anxieties generated by witnessing or experiencing paternal oppression, these do not automatically disappear, simply because the immediate perpetrator has been overthrown. They can persist, can transform, can re-emerge in new forms, even in the very person who fought hardest against their original manifestation. Cronus's tragedy, understood this way, is not simply that he was a bad person who did monstrous things. It is that he was a person formed by witnessing and then violently ending one cycle of paternal cruelty, who then, despite this formative experience, found himself recreating a version of that same cruelty when faced with his own fatherhood and his own fear of being overthrown. Chapter 25. Rhea's Position. Rhea's experience throughout this mythology deserves more sustained attention than the sources, focused as they are on the actions of male divine figures, typically provide. She married Cronus presumably during or shortly after the period of his Golden Age reign, presumably with whatever understanding of him that period of apparent peace and abundance would have suggested. A powerful, capable, perhaps even admirable husband, the king who had ended a great injustice and now presided over a flourishing world. What she discovered, through 5 repeated and devastating pregnancies, was a husband transformed by fear into someone willing to destroy, or at least to suspend in a state worse than death, every child she bore him. The mythology does not record her initial reaction to the first swallowing, but the pattern of her subsequent action, concealing her 6th pregnancy, arranging the deception with the stone, seeking her own mother's counsel and assistance, suggests a woman who had, by that point, exhausted whatever capacity she had for accepting this pattern, and had moved into active, careful, dangerous resistance. This required extraordinary courage and cunning. She was deceiving the king of the Titans, the most powerful being in the cosmos at that time, the same figure who had once wielded a sickle against his own father without hesitation. Had her deception been discovered before Zeus reached sufficient maturity to defend himself and eventually orchestrate the war that would free his siblings, the consequences for Rhea and for the hidden infant Zeus might have been severe in ways the mythology does not need to specify to make clear. She succeeded. Her plan worked across the span of years required for Zeus to grow to maturity, gather allies, and eventually force the confrontation that freed her other 5 children. This makes her, in a sense, often underappreciated in popular retellings that focus on Zeus as the active hero of the narrative, the figure whose careful, sustained, multi-year resistance against her husband's cruelty made everything that followed possible. Without Rhea's deception with the stone, there is no hidden Zeus growing to maturity in the Cretan cave. Without that hidden growth, there is no eventual confrontation, no titanomachy, no liberation of the swallowed siblings, no establishment of the Olympian order that would govern the subsequent mythology. The entire subsequent history of Greek divine governance depends, at its origin point, on a mother's careful and sustained resistance against a husband whose fear had made him a danger to every child she bore. The legacy and the later tradition. Part 7. How later generations understood him. Chapter 26. The Olympian memory of Cronus. Once Zeus and his siblings had established their governance of the cosmos following the Titanomachy, how did the new Olympian order remember and relate to the defeated father, whose cruelty had shaped so much of their own formation? The mythology suggests a complicated and not fully consistent relationship. Zeus, who had orchestrated his father's defeat, and presumably bore some responsibility for the decision to confine the Titans in Tartarus, does not appear in most sources as someone who dwelt extensively on his father's fate, or sought further punishment or reconciliation beyond the initial confinement. Having achieved supreme power and addressed the immediate threat his father had represented, Zeus moved forward into the governance of the new order, the establishment of Olympus, and the countless subsequent mythological episodes that would constitute the bulk of Greek mythological narrative. The 5 siblings who had been swallowed and then restored carried, presumably, more direct and personal trauma from their father's actions than Zeus himself, who had been hidden away and protected rather than personally subjected to the swallowing. Yet the mythology does not generally depict these siblings, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, as defined primarily by ongoing rage or trauma related to their father in their subsequent mythological roles. They take up their domains, develop their own complex mythological narratives, engage in the countless divine and mortal interactions that fill the broader tradition, without their father's crime, appearing as a constant defining shadow over their characterization. This relative silence about ongoing psychological impact is, in part, simply a feature of how ancient mythology generally worked. These sources were not primarily interested in extended psychological character development in the way modern literature might be, and the absence of extensive reflection on trauma does not necessarily indicate that the ancient audience understood these figures as untouched by what they had experienced. But the relative quickness with which the mythology moves past Cronus's defeat and confinement, treating it largely as a settled matter that establishes the foundation for subsequent Olympian governance, rather than as an ongoing source of family tension requiring continued attention, suggests something about how the ancient tradition understood the resolution of this particular conflict. Justice, in the form of the father's defeat and confinement, had been served, and the new generation could move forward into their own stories without needing to constantly revisit the founding trauma. Chapter 27. The Hesiodic Complexity. Hesiod himself, the primary source for both the Theogony's account of the violent succession and the works and days account of Cronus's golden age and his alternative fate ruling the Isles of the Blessed, deserves particular attention because his work preserves, within a single broader literary corpus attributed to a single ancient poet, the full complexity that this account has been attempting to honor. The Theogony does not soften the violence of Cronus's crimes. The castration of Uranos is depicted with stark physicality. The swallowing of the children is presented without euphemism. The eventual defeat and confinement in Tartarus is treated as a fitting consequence for tyrannical cruelty. And yet the same poetic tradition that produced this unflinching account of violence and cruelty also preserved, in a separate but related work, the memory of Cronus's reign as a golden age worth mourning, and the suggestion that his ultimate fate was not eternal punishment in the depths, but restored kingship over a blessed realm reserved for the most honored heroes. This is not, on reflection, a contradiction that needs to be explained away or resolved into a single, consistent account. It may instead represent something more sophisticated, an ancient recognition that complex figures can be simultaneously responsible for genuine atrocity and capable of having presided over genuine good, that a single life or reign can contain both authentic achievement worth remembering fondly and authentic crime deserving condemnation, without one cancelling out the other. Cronus's golden age was real in the mythological logic, even though his later cruelty was also real. His liberation of the world from Uranos's tyranny was a genuine achievement, even though his own subsequent tyranny over his children represented a devastating betrayal of everything that earlier action had stood for. His defeat and confinement was a genuinely deserved consequence of his crimes, even though the tradition could also imagine, in another register, a path toward eventual restoration that did not require eternal punishment to be the final word on his story. The willingness to hold these complexities together, rather than flattening Cronus into either pure monster or misunderstood hero, represents one of the more sophisticated aspects of how ancient Greek mythology approached its most morally complicated figures, an approach that modern retellings, often seeking simpler narratives of clear villainy or clear heroism, sometimes lose. Chapter 28. The Tragedy as Pattern. Looking across the full arc of Cronus's mythology, the courageous youngest son, the Golden Age king, the fearful father, the defeated tyrant, the, in some tellings, restored ruler of a blessed realm, a pattern emerges that exceeds the specific details of his individual story and speaks to something the Greek mythological tradition seemed to understand about the nature of power, fear, and succession more generally. The pattern Uranos established and cursed Cronus with, and which Cronus then enacted upon his own children before being overthrown by them in turn, did not, notably, end with Zeus's victory. The mythology preserves in various later episodes the persistent anxiety about succession that continued to trouble even the supposedly secure and established Olympian order. Zeus himself, warned by a prophecy that a child by the Titaness Metis would eventually produce a son who would overthrow him, exactly the pattern that had destroyed both his grandfather and his father, responded not by swallowing the child as Cronus had done, but by swallowing Metis herself while she was pregnant, a variation on the same essential strategy of preventing the threatening offspring from developing independently in the world. The result, famously, was the birth of Athena from Zeus's own head, the goddess of wisdom emerging in a manner that satisfied the letter of preventing an independent male heir, while still, in its own strange way, bringing the pregnancy to completion. This recurrence, Zeus, the very figure who had overthrown his own father's tyranny of fear, finding himself susceptible to a structurally similar fear regarding his own potential offspring, suggests that the mythology understood the pattern Uranos had cursed at the founding moment of divine succession as something deeper than a simple cycle that could be permanently broken by one act of justified rebellion. It suggests an understanding that the anxiety of the powerful regarding their eventual succession is a persistent structural feature of power itself, one that can re-emerge even in figures who have direct, formative experience of how devastating that anxiety's worst expressions can be. Cronus, in this broader view, is not simply an isolated monster whose particular psychology produced a unique horror. He is an instance, the most vivid and developed instance in the Greek tradition, but not a unique or isolated one, of a pattern that the mythology returns to repeatedly, the way that power, once achieved, generates its own anxieties about loss, and the way those anxieties can corrupt even figures who began their relationship with power through genuinely admirable and liberating action. Part 8. The Deeper Meanings. Chapter 29. Time, Agriculture, and the Sickle. Beyond the specific narrative of his crimes and his fate, Cronus's broader symbolic associations particularly with agriculture and with the sickle, the very instrument he used against his father, deserve attention for what they reveal about how the ancient mind connected this figure to fundamental processes of growth, harvest, and the passage of seasons. The sickle is, first and foremost, an agricultural tool, the implement used to harvest grain, to cut down the mature crop at the appropriate moment in its seasonal cycle. That this is also the weapon Cronus used to end his father's reign creates a symbolic resonance that the ancient tradition, and particularly its Roman development through the figure of Saturn, leaned into extensively. The cutting down of the old to make way for the new, the harvest that ends one cycle of growth, even as it makes possible the next planting and the next harvest. Saturn's particular association with agriculture in the Roman tradition. He was credited with teaching humanity the arts of agriculture during his Golden Age reign, with introducing the cultivation of crops that had made settled civilization and its abundance possible, reinforced this symbolic connection between the Titan turned god and the fundamental rhythms of planting, growth, harvest, and renewal that governed agricultural life throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. This agricultural symbolism adds another layer to understanding the swallowing of the children. If Cronus is associated with the harvest, with the cutting down of mature growth, then his swallowing of his own children can be read at a symbolic level that the ancient tradition may not have articulated explicitly, but that the underlying mythological logic suggests as a kind of premature or perverse harvest. The cutting down, or in this case the consumption, of growth before it has had the chance to mature, the prevention of the natural cycle's completion through an unnatural intervention motivated by fear rather than by the proper agricultural rhythm of allowing growth to reach its natural maturity before the harvest claims it. The eventual disgorgement of his children, by contrast, can be read as a kind of reversal of this perverse harvest, the uncutting of what had been prematurely cut, the restoration of growth that had been wrongfully prevented from reaching its proper maturity, allowing Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon to finally emerge into the mature divine existence that the swallowing had denied them. Chapter 30. The Mediterranean Context. It is worth situating Cronus's mythology within the broader context of ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean mythological traditions, because the pattern of divine succession through violent overthrow, son defeating father, new generation displacing old, was not unique to Greek mythology, but appears, with variations, across several related traditions from the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. The Hittite and Hurrian traditions of Anatolia, geographically and historically proximate to the early Greek world, preserve myths of succession among the gods that bear structural similarities to the Greek account of Uranos, Cronus, and Zeus, a sky god displaced by force, succeeded by another generation that eventually faces its own challenges to power. The Kumarbi myths, in particular, involve a figure who castrates a sky god, in some versions swallowing part of him in the process, in a manner that scholars have long noted as strikingly parallel to the Cronus-Uranos episode. This suggests that the Greek mythological tradition was not inventing this pattern of violent generational succession from nothing, but was instead developing in its own distinctive way themes and narrative structures that were present more broadly in the mythological inheritance of the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. Themes that may reflect genuine, widely shared human concerns about power, succession, generational conflict, and the anxiety of the established regarding the rising young. Understanding Cronus within this broader comparative context does not diminish the distinctiveness or power of the specifically Greek development of his story. The particular details of the swallowing, the stone, the disgorgement, the titanomachy, the alternative fate in the Isles of the Blessed are Greek mythological developments, even if they draw on broader patterns shared across the ancient Mediterranean world. But it does suggest that the psychological and structural concerns this myth addresses, fear of succession, the corruption of power, the cycle of violence between generations, were not narrow, peculiar concerns of the specifically Greek imagination, but reflected something more broadly resonant in how ancient peoples across a substantial geographic and cultural range understood the dynamics of power and its transmission across generations. Chapter 31. The Modern Resonance. The persistence of Cronus's mythology into the modern cultural imagination, through art, through psychology, through the continued use of saturnine and related terms to describe melancholic or harsh temperaments, through the ongoing fascination with Goya's devastating painting and its many subsequent artistic and cultural echoes, testifies to something that continues to resonate in this ancient story, despite the enormous cultural and historical distance separating the modern world from the context in which the myth originally developed. Part of this resonance surely lies in the myth's unflinching engagement with a genuinely difficult psychological reality, that parents can, and sometimes do, perceive their own children as threats to their authority, their identity, their continued relevance and centrality, and that this perception, however much it may be rooted in genuine insecurity or fear rather than malice, can produce devastating consequences when acted upon without restraint or reflection. Modern psychology has extensively documented patterns of parental behavior that, while rarely approaching the mythological extreme of literal consumption, nonetheless share the underlying structure Cronus's myth depicts. Parents who, consciously or unconsciously, work to prevent their children's full development and independence, who experience their children's growth and eventual surpassing of the parent as a threat rather than a natural and even desirable outcome of successful parenting, who respond to this perceived threat by various forms of limitation, control, or suppression that prevent the child from reaching their full potential. The myth's insistence on showing both Cronus's earlier heroism and his later cruelty, rather than presenting him as simply and consistently monstrous, also resonates with a modern psychological understanding that cruelty and harm are rarely the product of simple, uncomplicated villainy, but more often emerge from complex psychological processes, including, in many documented cases, the very kind of inherited trauma and fear that this account has suggested as a plausible reading of Cronus's transformation from liberator to tyrant. This is not to suggest that the ancient creators and transmitters of this myth were engaged in anything resembling modern psychological analysis in their own conscious understanding of the story. But it is to suggest that mythology, at its most enduringly powerful, often captures genuine and complex truths about human psychology and behavior in narrative form. Truths that later analytical frameworks can help articulate more explicitly, without thereby claiming to have invented or discovered something the ancient narrative tradition had not already, in its own way, understood. The full accounting. Part 9. Weighing the whole life. Chapter 32. What cannot be excused? Before concluding this account, it is necessary to be entirely clear about what the preceding exploration of complexity, context, and psychological pattern does not do. It does not excuse, minimize, or explain away the genuine horror of Cronus's central crime. He swallowed his own children. Not once, in a moment of uncontrollable panic that might generate some sympathy through its impulsiveness, but 5 times, repeatedly, with what the mythology's pattern suggests was deliberate, premeditated consistency. Each time Rhea labored to bring a child into the world, he was prepared, ready to act according to an established and repeated pattern, with no indication in the sources that he experienced doubt, hesitation, or moral struggle before each repetition of the act. This was not a single moment of weakness or a tragic mistake born of momentary fear. It was a sustained policy, repeated across 5 children, each one denied not merely their freedom, but their very existence as developing, independent beings, contained instead within their father's body in a suspended state that the mythology depicts as a genuine and devastating wrong. Whatever sympathy his earlier heroism against Uranus might generate, whatever understanding his inherited fear and the accuracy of his prophesied danger might provide, whatever complexity his later Golden Age reign and his eventual alternative fate in the Isles of the Blessed might add to the simple narrative of monstrous villainy, none of this erases or excuses the fundamental fact that he inflicted a profound and repeated wrong on his own children and on his wife, who was forced to endure the repeated grief of this wrong without recourse for years before she finally found a way to resist. The mythology itself does not excuse him. His defeat and confinement, in the dominant tradition, is presented as just consequence rather than tragic overreaction. Even the alternative tradition of his restoration to rule over the Isles of the Blessed does not suggest that his crimes were forgiven or forgotten. It suggests, at most, that even a figure guilty of such crimes might eventually find some form of restored purpose, without this restoration constituting an endorsement or minimization of what came before. Chapter 33. The necessary complexity. And yet the willingness to hold this clear moral condemnation alongside an honest accounting of his earlier heroism, his Golden Age achievement, and his complex psychological formation does not represent moral confusion or an attempt to muddy clear ethical waters. It represents instead a more truthful and more useful way of understanding how moral catastrophe actually occurs in beings, divine or human, who are not simple, one-dimensional embodiments of pure evil. The most devastating human and mythological tragedies rarely involve figures who are simply, consistently monstrous from beginning to end. They more often involve figures who possessed genuine capacity for good, who demonstrated at some point in their story real courage, real care, real achievement worth honoring, and who then, through some combination of fear, trauma, accumulated power, and moral failure, became capable of inflicting genuine horror on those who depended on them. Understanding Cronus only as the simple monster who ate his children, without also reckoning with the youngest Titan, who alone among his siblings found the courage to act against Uranus's tyranny, without also reckoning with the king whose Golden Age reign was remembered and celebrated for centuries after his fall, produces a less complete and ultimately less useful understanding of what his myth actually offers. The complete account, liberator and tyrant, golden king and devouring father, justly defeated and, in some tellings, eventually restored, offers something the simple monster narrative cannot. A genuine exploration of how fear corrupts, how power that begins in justified rebellion against tyranny can curdle into a new and different tyranny, how the pattern of inherited trauma can persist even in figures who have direct, formative experience of that trauma's worst expressions, and how a single life or reign can contain both achievement worth remembering and crime deserving unambiguous condemnation. This complexity is not a dilution of moral clarity about his crimes. It is the necessary context for understanding how such crimes become possible in beings who are not simply, originally, and consistently evil, which is to say, in beings very much like the actual humans, and the mythology suggests actual gods, who continue to grapple with the same fundamental dynamics of fear, power, and succession that his story so vividly depicts. Chapter 34. The Question of Forgiveness. Did Cronus deserve forgiveness? Did he receive it, in whatever sense the mythological tradition allows for divine figures to receive or be denied forgiveness? The sources do not provide a clean answer to this question, and perhaps the lack of clean answer is itself significant. The dominant tradition of permanent confinement in Tartarus suggests no forgiveness was extended, that his crimes were severe enough to warrant eternal punishment in the cosmos's deepest and darkest region, alongside the other defeated titans who had supported his tyrannical rule. The alternative tradition of restoration to rule over the Isles of the Blessed suggests something different, not necessarily forgiveness in any explicit, articulated sense, but perhaps a recognition that even profound wrongdoing need not be the eternal and final word on a being's entire existence, that there might be other roles, other forms of purpose, available even to those who have committed genuine and serious crimes. Zeus himself, who had the most direct cause for resentment against his father, having been hidden away at birth specifically to escape the fate his 5 older siblings suffered, having grown up with full knowledge of what his father had done and was prepared to continue doing, does not appear in the sources as someone who dwelt extensively on forgiveness or its absence regarding Cronus. He acted to end the threat, to free his siblings, to establish a new and, in his judgment, more just order. Whether he forgave his father in any psychological sense, the mythology does not record, perhaps because the question of forgiveness, as a developed psychological and ethical concept, was not the primary lens through which this ancient tradition understood the resolution of such conflicts. What the mythology does suggest, through its preservation of multiple, not fully consistent accounts of Cronus's ultimate fate, is a kind of productive ambiguity. The tradition was not required to settle, once and for all, whether justice demanded eternal punishment, or whether some form of eventual restoration was compatible with the severity of his crimes. Different tellings, different contexts, different purposes for invoking his story could draw on different aspects of this complex and not fully reconciled legacy. Chapter 35. The Final Accounting. What then is the complete account of Cronus, the Titan, the King, the Father, the figure who has come down through millennia of cultural transmission as one of mythology's most resonant and disturbing figures? He was born the youngest of 12 Titans, into a world already marked by his father's cruelty toward his unborn siblings. He alone among his older, more established siblings found the courage to act against that cruelty, taking the sickle his mother offered, and ending Uranus's tyranny through an act of violence that was, simultaneously, a genuine liberation and a devastating wound inflicted on his own father. He ruled, for some span of time, that the tradition remembers fondly across centuries of subsequent cultural memory over a golden age, a time of peace, abundance, and ease that later generations would invoke whenever they wished to imagine a better and more equal world. A memory powerful enough to generate one of antiquity's most beloved annual festivals. He carried, throughout this golden reign, the knowledge of a curse prophecy delivered by his own defeated father, that the pattern of son overthrowing father would not end with this single act, but would eventually be turned against him as well. And when his own children began to be born, this knowledge, perhaps combined with deeper psychological patterns of inherited fear and trauma that the myth does not fully articulate, but clearly implies, drove him to a horrifying response. He swallowed each child as it was born, denying them the chance to develop independently, containing them within his own body in a state that was neither true life nor death. His wife Rhea, after enduring this devastating pattern 5 times, found the courage and the cunning to resist, concealing her 6th pregnancy, deceiving her husband with a stone disguised as an infant, and arranging for the actual child, who would become Zeus, to be raised in hidden safety, away from his father's knowledge. That hidden child grew to maturity, gathered allies, and eventually forced a confrontation that resulted in the disgorgement of his 5 swallowed siblings and a cataclysmic 10-year war between the Titans and the new Olympian generation. This war, the Titanomachy, was finally won by the Olympians through the crucial alliance of the long-confined Cyclopes and Hundred-Handed, whose liberation echoed and completed the very pattern of freedom from confinement that Cronus's original action against Uranus had begun but apparently never fully resolved. Defeated, Cronus was confined, in the dominant tradition, in the depths of Tartarus, alongside his fellow vanquished Titans. Though an alternative and equally ancient tradition preserves the memory of his eventual restoration, to rule over a blessed realm reserved for the most honored dead. A final echo of the golden age his original reign had once represented. This is Cronus, liberator and tyrant, golden king and devouring father, justly overthrown and, in some tellings, eventually restored. A figure whose story refuses the comfort of simple categorization, whose complete account demands the simultaneous holding of genuine admiration and unambiguous condemnation, whose myth has proven capable across millennia of cultural transmission and reinterpretation, of speaking to truths about power, fear, succession, and the corruption of even genuinely heroic beginnings that remain as resonant now as they were when first told around fires in the deep prehistory of the Greek mythological imagination. Epilogue. The sickle still falls. Every culture, in some form, tells the story of the father who fears the son. It is told in palace intrigues and corporate succession battles, in the psychology of aging parents watching their children's achievements, with a complexity of feeling that pure pride does not fully capture, in the structures of institutions whose founders cannot release control, even when release would serve everyone better, including the founder's own legacy. Cronus is the Greek tradition's most developed and most haunting version of this universal story. Not because his particular crimes are unique to him, but because the mythology surrounding him refuses to simplify what it depicts. He was capable of genuine courage and genuine cruelty, of genuine achievement and genuine atrocity, of inspiring genuine celebration of a remembered golden age, even while bearing genuine and lasting responsibility for an act of paternal violence that remains, 3,000 years after it was first told, one of the most disturbing images in the entire Western mythological tradition. The sickle he used against his father became, through later confusion and conflation, the scythe of time itself, the instrument that cuts down all things, that ends every reign and every life and every age, that makes way, through its cutting, for what comes after. This transformation of his story's central instrument into a symbol of time's universal, inexorable harvesting captures something essential about why his myth has persisted. He represents not merely a specific ancient story about a specific ancient figure, but something closer to a permanent feature of how power, fear, and succession interact across every generation, every institution, every relationship between the established and the rising. He is still, in this sense, swallowing his children. Wherever fear of being surpassed leads to the suppression rather than the celebration of the next generation's potential, wherever those who hold power respond to the natural and inevitable process of succession with attempts at prevention and control, rather than acceptance and even welcome. And he is still, in this sense, being overthrown. Wherever the courage that he himself once embodied against his own father's tyranny finds new embodiment in those willing to challenge the cruelties of established power, even when that power was once, itself, a liberating force against an earlier tyranny. The pattern continues. The sickle still falls. The golden age is still remembered, and the swallowing is still mourned, and the liberation is still celebrated, in the endlessly recurring drama of generations succeeding generations, that Cronus's myth, more vividly than perhaps any other single mythological narrative, captures in its full and terrible complexity. He was the youngest Titan who dared to act. He was the Golden King whose reign became legend. He was the father who could not bear to be surpassed. He was the tyrant justly overthrown. He was, in some tellings, restored to rule again. He is Cronus. His story has not ended. It recurs in new forms in every generation that must negotiate the passage of power from those who hold it to those who will eventually, inevitably, succeed them. The sickle still falls. Here ends the story of Cronus, youngest of the Titans, son of sky and earth, liberator who became tyrant, golden king who became devouring father, defeated ruler who, in some tellings, found restoration beyond his fall. His crime against his children remains one of mythology's most haunting images. His earlier courage against his own father's tyranny remains one of mythology's most significant acts of liberation. Both are true. Both must be held. He took the sickle when his older siblings would not. He ruled an age remembered as golden for 1,000 years after its passing. He swallowed what he should have released into the world. He was overthrown by exactly the pattern he had once enacted against his own father. He rules, in some accounts, still, over a blessed realm, beyond the reach of ordinary time. The pattern he lived and the pattern he enacted continue in every generation, wherever power meets its own succession. He is Cronus. The sickle still falls.